Hello, pawb. It's Iolo Jones here. And like many of you, I'm interested in what community planning can offer Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwyrndrobwllllantysiliogogogoch. Um, During my work on the town council, I have come across planning and the planning system a few times. Part of the new draft Conwy local development plan, part of that was having a new deposit site on Caerffyrnon. And of course, there was a proposal for the new flyover at A55 junction 15. So, these sort of incidents really remind you of the importance of the planning system in shaping our community. And the town council is very much aware of this. And as you're probably aware, they've established the Future Plan initiative in the last couple of years to start looking at what sort of visions we have for Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwyrndrobwllllan and how we can take them forward. And on a personal level, I've also been inspired by it, and I've gone and studied a master's in town planning in Liverpool. And as part of this master's, I had to carry out a final research project, and the logical focus for me was coming back to Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwyrndrobwllllan and seeing how we can ensure effective engagement with the planning system going forward. So first of all, what is community planning? It's a term that's bandied about a fair bit, and it can mean various things to various people. And studying these interpretations is very much part and parcel of the research that I carried out. But essentially, it can be reduced to a statement of intent as to the future of the community. So drawing together evidence to provide a roadmap to the future. And there's various ways that community planning has been interpreted, as I've mentioned. For example, there's a requirement in Wales for local authorities to prepare a community strategy, setting out how they listen to communities and address their concerns. And also through more recent legislation, the Local Government and Elections Wales Act 2021 summarises the theme of devolved government in Wales, in that there's a rhetorical emphasis on partnership. There's a greater general power of competence for community councils is coming in, which will allow for more localised government, provided they meet certain tests to prove their competence. Again, there's more requirements for local authorities to develop public participation schemes, more flexibility for public service boards, which work across local authorities and joint working. And importantly, for community planning, the introduction of new place plans. Now, you may be aware of English neighbourhood plans, where citizens define an area of study and put forward proposals for its future, and eventually put a set of proposals forward to a referendum, local referendum, which, if passed, forms a binding plan for that area. Place plans are sort of the Welsh take on neighbourhood plans, and they don't have a referendum. Instead, they have a sort of petitions system to raise issues of concern. But they are looking at formalising community planning in legislation. So the statements of the community will have more legal weight. This study, which I carried out, is focusing on public participation in community planning, as I said. And I just briefly like to introduce two key theoretical models that I've used. The first is Einstein's ladder, which dates from 1969. And this is essentially setting out degrees of citizen control within consultation. So it's a ladder of participation. The higher you go up the ladder, the more engaged are ordinary residents or citizens. And this was important at the time because Planners haven't always been very good at talking to ordinary people. In the post-war years, when the modern planning system was set up in 1947, they were working, planners were very sort of technical experts working for some unspecified public good. And they sort of felt they had carte blanche to work towards that end. And carried out only tokenistic consultation with the residents, if any. Now, following a few questionable developments, that eventually began to be revised. As I say, this model's from 1969. And eventually they moved through a place in the 1980s where they were mediating between conflicting interests. And in the late 1990s, planners began to be seen more as mediators. Not necessarily between conflicting interests, but also members of the public. And so rather than assuming they were working for a public good, they were actually engaging with people to see what they wanted. And ostensibly, these collaborative methods are now the backbone of the planning system. So, you know, according to theory, we have moved up the ladder from a sort of informing the public what's going on to more of a partnership model. This isn't necessarily the case in practice, especially when you consider austerity cuts, which really hamper the effectiveness of consultation and mean that staff often have to focus on core duties. So this research, again, will sort of use this model to see how effective the participation is in local community planning. The second theoretical model is Miller's compass of reactions to social exclusion. So this is the assumption that somebody will always be losing out when it comes to consultation, and how to include people who are less likely to be engaged. So you can see it's based on two scales. On the horizontal scale, you have intervention by state forces, strong to weak. And on the vertical scale, you have social diversity, weak at the top and strong at the bottom. So each quadrant represents a slightly different reaction to how do you include those left-out citizens? You know, so in planning terms, who doesn't feel they can engage with the planning system, and how would the state go about engaging them? So if we start in the top left, required inclusion. This is where state intervention is high and social homogeneity is high. So this means that action is being as part of being a citizen. So, for example, mandatory voting, which is the norm in some countries, would be in this quadrant, where citizens have to comply, have to feed into the system. So, for example, having to feed into the planning system, you know, you have no choice. Then, if we move to the right, the voluntary inclusion quadrant, you can describe this as use it or lose it, and this is essentially the model we have currently in the United Kingdom planning system, or the Welsh planning system, which is, you know, developed over the last 20 years after devolution. So this is if you know how to navigate the system, then you're able to be included, and if you don't know how to navigate the system, then you are left out. And also, yeah, so another example for this might be universal credit, where the government will pay you benefits if you're eligible, but you have to follow their system and follow their rules, you know, attend job seeker meetings, etc., in order to be able to receive that benefit. And if you disagree with any of that process, or don't go along with any of that process, you will lose that benefit. We move around clockwise again to exclusive diversity. This is essentially a libertarian outlook where any progress has to come from self-organized groups of individuals. So this is putting the onus very much on the ordinary resident, where any moves towards inclusion have to come, from self-organized groups. There's no help from the state. And finally, the inclusive diversity quadrant. This is where the state recognizes that there's a high social diversity in ability to engage. So, for example, some people maybe have the time and formal knowledge to engage with planning systems. Others may be very busy working, or need help with childcare, or not know the planning system, and therefore find it much more difficult to engage. So the state recognizes diversity, and they're very much trying to help people engage. And an example of this might be grants to university students, where those from poorer backgrounds are given proportionally larger grants to make up for that social diversity. So again, this compass will be used when it comes to moves as to how to engage with planning consultation. Now, very quickly about my project. As I said, where better to do it in Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr. There's various active planning matters going on here. The Town Council has begun to develop the future plan vision. So we have a new group starting. Personally, I've been a Town Council for 3 years here, and I feel like that's a good place to start consulting people, and it certainly helped recruit people to contribute to my research methods. Although in my dissertation, reflexivity was of course a very important part of that research, being self-aware, knowing that certain people will be more likely to answer my questionnaire than others. And the way that I've chosen to examine community planning in Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr is through an examination of the dynamic between two groups, essentially. So residents on the one hand, and slightly more influential actors on the other. And I've grouped together a few people here. So we have town councillors who have slightly more knowledge of the planning system and are more aware of ongoing schemes. We have county councillors who, again, all that applies to them as well. And then we have local authority planning officers who are obviously very well briefed on planning goings on, but maybe less connected to Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr particularly. So this led into my research questions. I'll just draw your attention to the diagram, because this is maybe an easy way to explain. The two groups I talked about just now are in the yellow boxes, so residents on one hand, more influential actors on the other. The orange boxes represent the methods I chose to draw out the themes in the green boxes from those actors. So I was looking for perceptions of the planning system, motivations as to why people do or don't engage with the planning system, experiences of engaging in the past, and judgments for how to improve consultation performance. And then the research questions essentially match between the groups and the themes that we're looking at. So I'll leave that up for a few seconds. So I surveyed 50 people, so questionnaires to 50 residents, and carried out 8 interviews including 6 councillors and 2 planning staff. So that gave me a rich array of data to work with. I would say the questionnaire sample was not representative necessarily of the village as a whole. There was certainly a range of people contributed, but it was not completely representative. And this is sort of borne out by some of the demographic data that I've collected. So there's 4 graphs here showing some of the demographic data, and we'll go left to right, top to bottom. So the sample is in orange and the Llanfyddin as a whole is in yellow. And so as you can see, respondents to the questionnaire were more likely to be aged between 45 and 64 than the average resident of Llanfyddin. They tended to have lived in Llanfyddin for a long time, over half of respondents for over 20 years. Respondents to the questionnaire were slightly more likely to own their home than the average resident, and were much more likely to hold a higher level of qualification, so especially degree level or above, than the average resident. As you can see, the sort of normal spread in Llanfyddin is fairly equally spread across all groups, but the questionnaire sample is very much weighted towards people with degrees. So yeah, not an entirely representative sample, but that doesn't take away from the spread of answers and the main themes in the answers. So first big question, who should be influencing community planning? And I prompted with various actors, down from Westminster politicians, and then, as you can see, it sort of works its way more locally. At Westminster, we go south through county councillors and councillors to local residents and also private businesses. And what you can see here is a broad cascade of increasing support for influence, which might be expected. So very few people thought that Westminster politicians or civil servants should be involved in community planning. Most people thought that Senedd politicians and civil servants should have some influence over community planning, but not strong influence. And then when we come down to county council, you can see that the vast majority agree that they should have some influence over community planning, and about 30% think they should have a strong influence. By the time we get to town council, 2/3 think that the town council should have a strong influence, with most of the rest agreeing they should have some influence over community planning. The strongest message here, though, is an overwhelming support that local residents should feed into community planning, into the future of their village. Maybe not surprising, but reassuring nonetheless. And then private businesses, this was an interesting one. Many questionnaire respondents interpreted private businesses as being local businesses, although there were a few which interpreted this as meaning volume house builders. So this was somewhere where I could have been clearer. And then there were a few answers which received more support than some of the prompted answers. So for example, local schools, hospitals, environmental groups. A significant number of respondents believed that these should have an influence over community planning. More respondents agreed with them than Westminster politicians, ironically. So again, I'll leave that up there for a few seconds. It's worth noting as well, for my previous slide, sorry, that despite the questionnaire being bilingual, we didn't receive a single answer in Welsh, even though 47% of the village can speak Welsh, which again might speak to representation of the sample. Certainly not every opinion in the village will have been captured by the questionnaire, simply because some groups, such as Welsh speakers, haven't been included or haven't taken part. Right, given an overwhelming support for residents to influence community planning, how keen were questionnaire respondents to engage in future consultation? Well, you can see broad support in principle for engaging. We have about a third saying that they'd be very likely to engage, and another third saying they'd be likely, with most of the rest, not committing one way or the other. So that's very promising. That's most people saying they'd be very interested in engaging with, a future community planning initiative which looked at the future of the village. I asked a follow-up question to zoom into the factors affecting motivation. So, as you might expect, an interest in the local area and a feeling of embeddedness in the community meant that people were very likely to engage, more likely to participate in community planning. Whereas conversely, few people didn't feel part of the community or didn't have an interest in the local area. People feeling their voice would or wouldn't be heard. This was the most important factor. This swung everyone one way or the other. So people need to feel that the voice is heard in the planning system in order to take part. No one wants to throw their comments into a void. So yeah, this was a very important factor, and we'll get that forms part of the recommendations later. About a third of people admitted to self-interest or a feeling of obligation, spurring them on to engage with community planning, which is fair enough. You can see that the most limiting factor, or the biggest demotivator for people, over half of people, was the available time. So over half of people felt that they didn't have enough time to contribute to community planning initiatives. And then we have a couple of other factors which most people didn't choose at the bottom. So again, I'll leave that up for a few seconds so we can have a look. Then we're looking at experiences of the planning system. So how much faith do people have that their voice is heard based on their previous experiences? And conversely to the previous pie chart, this is broadly negative. Most people think their voice is heard to some extent or barely in the planning system. Very few said their voice was heard strongly, and almost a third said they weren't heard at all, or they weren't sure. So that's worrying from a planner's perspective, because planners generally want the public to be involved in the planning system nowadays. And certainly many planners state this publicly. So this is an issue. And so how do we rectify this situation? How do we rectify the fact that most people don't feel like their voice is heard in the planning system? Well, I prompted with 15 potential responses to this. And here you can see, support for these ranges from less than 30% to 70%. So there's a good range of support there. And from the top, being able to contribute to community planning without attending meetings. This is the most popular option, and yeah, perhaps not surprising. Followed by the establishment of a community space where all can contribute. Now, that could be something simple like an ideas box, or it could be an online map of Llanelechon, for example, where people can pick a location, point out an idea, and then people can, you know, support that idea if they like. And then we work our way all the way down the list, and you know, we see that online access is the least, you know, the least important concern to people. Interestingly, the holding local referenda on issues of concern was the third most popular, and petition system was the second least popular, and that's, you know, the first is part of the English planning system and the second is part of the Welsh planning system, so that's interesting. Again, I will leave that up there because there's quite a lot of information to look at there. Now, what's interesting with these potential actions is that they can be grouped, and the way that people supported these actually fell very neatly into 4 groups. So you have 4 groups corresponding to the 4 quadrants on Miller's compass. And I find it quite astounding that the levels of support they've received means that they've fallen exactly into these 4 groups. So to explain this a bit in more detail, here's the compass again. So least popular were methods to increase opportunity for input into the current system. So if we go back, that's contributing without going online, a petition system to raise issues of concern, and more frequent opportunities for input into the current system. So that was the least popular. So the current system is obviously not working for people. Then we have required inclusion, where the responsibility for producing and managing input is put onto residents. So if we go back again, this is, you know, pushing control of the process onto residents and requiring residents to submit their opinions, like mandatory voting, but with the planning system. So that was, again, not very popular among residents. Fairly popular among residents were this sort of libertarian outlook, where traditional methods are replaced with accessible alternatives, where residents take the initiative to engage with them. So again, some of the suggested actions here included using more understandable language and illustrations for planning, making online content more accessible, and improving the communication of process. So these are all things which would make the planning system easy to understand, easy to feed into, but people would still have to take the initiative to do that. And most popular in terms of actions was this inclusive diversity quadrant, where traditional spheres of powers, such as meetings, are replaced with transparent, accessible spaces, where people can visibly see that their input translates into action. And some of the actions which corresponded to this were this collaborative online, collaborative ideas space, a local referenda, and a clear integration of resident feedback. So there we are. The prompted actions fitted perfectly into the compass, which I would never have expected when designing the research project. And this very much feeds into the recommendations for councils and Welsh Government. So the vast majority favour resident opinions being acted on by representatives. be they councillors or dedicated officers. That's a major finding, and this is backed up by this question, where we can see that over half support the statement that community planning initiatives should be led and guided by elected public representatives or a dedicated staff officer, but residents should have frequent opportunities to input their opinions. And then you can see that a quarter is a very similar stance, that residents should provide their opinions, which are then acted on by elected public representatives or a dedicated staff officer. So there's just a slight nuance there. But interestingly, the proportion of respondents who thought that residents should lead on community planning initiatives throughout, so this is the self-organisational model, was fairly low. And you can see there about 15% of respondents, which is perhaps surprising. But yeah, that message came through very strongly from the questionnaires, was that residents preferred representatives to guide the process, but to include options, includes opportunities for residents to input their opinions. So this was all the questions from the survey I sent to residents, and I'll also quickly go through some of the quotes from my interviews. So planning officers very much viewed community planning through the lens of place plans. So through the through their work, they've acquired a very particular view of this legislation and how it applies to communities. So you can see here, let's say planning is very black and white. It doesn't matter how positive you try to be with certain issues, they could still go against planning legislation, therefore they just cannot be done. However, that's not to say that they weren't keen to engage the community. It came through very strongly, they were very keen. In fact, as you can see, my job title and salary may be provided by a local authority, but I do my best to work for the people that I represent. So the planning officers were actually very keen to reach out to people, recognised that in the past planning officers hadn't always done that, but are keen to work with people to work towards place plans, which they see as a very useful tool to enshrine people's views in legislation. So yeah, now they hope to see engagement as a term being used in planning with actual reality, as opposed to where you need to engage the community because it's expected and it's a tick box exercise. So a very, very positive outlook there among planning officers. And in fact, Comrie Council has the only dedicated place plan officer in Wales, or the first dedicated place plan officer in Wales. They're sort of blazing the trail when it comes to place plans. So it's very promising with regards to future plan and yeah, working towards developing that local planning process in Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr. Among councillors, there was more mixed views of community planning. Some thought it was very vague, but generally most agreed, well, all agreed that the more localised you can get it, the better it will be. Again, councillors were very keen to engage with the public and to make sure that everyone's voice was heard in the planning system. Despite previous setbacks, you know, there have been consultation efforts in the past, which haven't come anywhere, whether that's due to inflexible legislation or any other reason, you know, lack of funding, other reasons. Councillors are still very keen to engage residents, make sure that, you know, that the plans concerning Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr are actually reflective of the views of the population. So it's happened many times in different formats over the years, but that isn't to say we shouldn't keep trying. if people can have an input, I think that's really important. Even though we might start off small, they might grow into something. So yeah, very broad support here among planning officers and councillors that we should start working on collaborative projects with residents, start off small, and eventually it'll grow into a fully fledged community plan. So in conclusion, there's a new path for community planning in Wales. If people are willing to engage with this place planning process, it seems quite promising. While traditional consultation methods favoured professional citizens or those with the time and expertise to contribute, planners, councillors and respondents are all keen to engage. So it may just be a matter of putting aside preconceptions and past experiences and working together on this new project. However, residents do need to be reassured that their voice will be heard, and this is why I have made a few recommendations to future plan and more broadly. We need to take steps to build confidence slowly, and this is where to climb that ladder of participation, we need to sort of take steps. And this is where those actions and their place in the compass is important. Councillors view their role more as empowering residents than in representing them, and that this works very well with the actions that most survey respondents backed, which were the state helping citizens to engage with the process. So recommendations to Welsh Government is to ensure that resident feedback is transparently incorporated into plans. This came out very strongly in the survey. People need to feel their voices heard. That's critical. For county councils, Conwy's example is very promising, dedicating resources and staff to place planning, and very positive overtures and interviews. So follow Conwy's example and follow through. For town councils, an important message from this research project is to take the lead on initiating community plans and other projects. Don't necessarily expect residents to take the lead themselves, because many don't feel able to contribute. Many people don't feel capable of responding to planning consultation or to feed into the planning system. And that's not to say they're not able, it's that many people simply don't feel able. And so it sort of falls to town councillors who have more background knowledge in the of ongoing projects to take the lead, and also to pay particular attention to including the opinions of all residents, because there's a danger of community planning sampling only a certain sample of residents, the usual suspect, you might call them, and in fact that could be counterproductive. For example, if community planning engages only a small group of people who are perhaps have a very much a higher income than the norm in the village, and have the time to engage and the expertise, what that could do is it could have, on the face of it, a very successful community plan, which increase the desirability of the village, increase house prices. But the downside of that, of course, is that those who don't own their own home, who may be renting, or with a housing association, they've not been included in the plan making process, and now they're being pushed out by rising house prices, rising rents. So it's really, really important to pay attention to the opinions of all residents when carrying out the project. And finally, to residents, yeah, put aside past experiences, perhaps preconceptions, and have your say. Make sure that your voice is heard, because it's all our village. You know, we all have a voice in it, and make sure that that's heard by the system. It's hopefully new legislation will help with that, and certainly from the interviews I did, the councillors and planning officers are very keen to interpret that in a way which favours residents. So yeah, go for it, try it, and we'll see what future Llanfachan has in store.